Hi guys, my name is Josh, and this is a project I'm working on for a neuroscience class I'm taking at UCR. Without further ado, let's begin. So the title of my video is going to be the action potential and all the curious tips and tricks that we need to know. And so a little bit about this is I'm going to be teaching you guys the basis of the rundown of the whole action potential from start to end, and how important voltage gated ions are in these different steps. And overall, you guys will learn a lot about action potentials, hopefully. But let's begin. So we've been hearing a lot about neurons. We've been hearing a lot about nerves. About a lot of different things in neuroscience. But let's get down to the basis. What is a neuron? A neuron is a stimuli that basically fires an electrical input that runs down the axon. That's basically what the basic thing we need to know. Now, the nerve impulse is known as an action potential. Overall, let's take a step back and see how this action potential works, because we need to understand what it does to our body. Because our body is filled with a lot of potentials and different charges. And this is just for reference in regards to one day you're sitting down and you see a spider on your hand. What makes you flick it, you know? So let's begin. Before we start about action potentials, let's talk about the different parts and how everything else is important and what makes up an action potential. So here are some quick So basically, we have positive and negative charges just like anything else, and they attract. We need to separate these energies to keep them from just going all over the place. Now, when we build a barrier, there's a lot of power and energy between these. But before we begin, let's talk about some vocabulary words we should know. So, voltage. Voltage is a measure of potential energy generated by separated charges. And this in a cell is known as membrane potential. Remember we talked about it before? Now we're getting into it. Okay, another important word is current. This is known as the flow of electricity from one point to another. An important thing to know about current is that current equals voltage over resistance. Well, what's resistance, Josh? Well, resistance refers to whatever is getting in the way of a current. So we have something going in opposite directions. That could be known as resistance. So now that we know these important vocabulary words, how does all that work and what does it mean to action potential? So action potential. A neuron is usually sitting in a resting potential state. It's just like a battery that's ready to be used when needed. In a resting potential state, the membrane potential is exactly -70 millivolts. Meanwhile, outside there's a bunch of positive sodium ions just floating around. Meanwhile, on the inside, the neuron holds potassium ions that are positive but surrounded by bigger negatively charged proteins. This makes the cell's interior negatively charged overall. When the neuron is negative, it is considered polarized. This flow all works because of a infamous protein channel called sodium-potassium pumps. This can all be found along the axon of the neuron. How does this work? Well, it works by taking 2 potassium ions into the cell and it pumps 3 sodium ions outside. This allows for a concentration that is more positive on the outside of the neuron. This leads to a gradient. But just like everything else, the goal in biology is to have balance in energies. So when this happens, the other way to come into a cell to try to reach that goal is through ion channels. Remember how we talked about the voltage gated ions, gates, channels? Yes, now we're gonna get into it. This is a large protein that provides a safe passage for ions to cross the membrane. Most of these are voltage gated channels. They open and close in response to channels in the membrane potential. The movement of ions is the key to all electrical events in neurons. So that's the big thing. This in neurons. Ultimately, we want to depolarize the neuron. This will hopefully open the voltage gated channels. But we need a big stimulus rather than a small stimulus, because a small stimulus can be considered a false alarm. But with a big stimulus, we can actually have our threshold of negative 55 millivolts to be met. And when it is met, tons and tons of sodium ions move in and make the membrane positive to the point where we actually go positive 40 millivolts. This is action potential. This is action potential in the works. We need to depolarize back to try to meet that balance again. But when that happens, this causes a voltage gated potassium ion channel to open and let potassium flow out. When this happens, to try to balance itself out, this is known as the hyperpolarization. The thing is, when the ions are pouring out, too many actually pour out, and we're met at the negative 75 millivolt mark once again. Overall, this is called the resting membrane potential. So the cycle begins all over and repeats, and it happens over many times over multiple periods. So now, to summarize exactly what we talked about, there are a few steps we need to know about action potential. It's the depolarization state, the repolarization, and then the hyperpolarization. And this all works for action potential alongside the important voltage gated ion channels. Without this, a lot of our body things would not work as well as we'd picture. And unfortunately for you guys, now we know, we have a good understanding. And I really just want to say thank you for all you guys watching, and thank you for understanding and taking the time and watching this video. I'll see you guys next time.